I'd like to thank Rod Smith and everyone at Utah Valley who was a part of organizing this excellent symposium. I'd like to thank the morning panels who have set such a high standard, and a special thanks to Doug Laycock for his characteristically inspiring and powerful remarks at lunch. Our task at this panel is to revisit the foundational school prayer case, Engel versus Vitale, one of the most controversial decisions in Supreme Court history. Engel was as controversial as Dred Scott. It affected more school districts than Brown. It brought conservative Roman Catholics and evangelical Protestants to a common cause long before Roe versus Wade. It triggered thousands of proposals to overturn it, mostly by amending the Constitution. But more than 50 years after that decision, one of the most important things to understand about Engel is that battles about school prayer did not begin with that groundbreaking decision. Such battles started with the very first public schools, which took hold shortly before the 20th century, when civic leaders in New York decided that these schools were essential to address rising waves of immigration. While the founders of these schools made them non-denominational, they understood that all schools transmit values and morals as well as knowledge. They feared, in an eerie precursor to our current day, that massive immigration by Irish and European Catholics presented a threat to American democratic values. They saw Catholic, Jewish, and Asian immigrants as fearsome others and were determined to assimilate and Americanize those threatening immigrants. In order to impress American values on these children, early public schools typically required daily readings from the Protestant King James Bible, used textbooks like the McGuffey Reader, rife with anti-Catholic slurs, and required the recitation of prayers comfortable to Protestants. Catholics who refused to participate in these exercises or who sought to use their own Douay Bible were punished, often with beatings, and expelled. Such conflicts led to nativist street riots and deaths in places like Boston and Philadelphia. Many Catholics left to start their own schools, a solution the Supreme Court blessed in Pierce versus Society of Sisters. But some remained. Some filed suits in state courts, challenging the religious exercises in the public schools as sectarian and relying on state constitutional guarantees. And some of those early suits were successful. The Illinois Supreme Court invalidated recitation of the Lord's Prayer as compulsory worship and found readings from the King James Bible to be improper sectarian instruction in 1910. That court held that these readings were not only sectarian to Catholics, but to Jews, other non-Christians, and non-believers. That court also said it is no duty of the state to teach religion. But such rulings remained a minority position, and public school religious exercises remained common in American schools through the first half of the 20th century. Then we reached the religious revival period of the 1950s, an era when Billy Graham, Norman Vincent Peale, and the influential Bishop Fulton Sheen became important public figures, and fear of communism and evangelical revivals made potent common cause. In 1951, the New York Board of Regents adopted a short prayer for use in the New York public schools at the beginning of the school day. It required all of 12 seconds to recite. Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. The prayer was intentionally non-sectarian and reflected a wave of enthusiasm for expressions of civil religion that was typical of the 1950s. The New York governor at the time, Thomas Dewey, said this prayer would distinguish America and Americans from the Soviet Union's, quote, slave world of godless communism. Such contrasts were frequently drawn. When the U.S. Congress added under God to the pledge in 1954, it was explained in a committee report that American government rests on the dignity of individual human beings, and these human beings are important because they are created by God and endowed by God with inalienable rights that no civil authority can usurp. Communism was frequently described as a system which debased human dignity and elevated the collective over the individual because it denied the importance of God-given alienable rights. In a climate when faith and patriotism ran hand in hand, how in the world did the Engel plaintiffs prevail? The Engel plaintiffs were 5 families, 9 children between them, some like the Roths, devoutly agnostic, others like Engel himself, a Reformed Jew. Engel had said at the beginning of the litigation, when you rattle off a prayer like that and there is no meaning to it, you vitiate the value of religion. The school's response was that the prayer was ecumenical and parents could withdraw their children by written request. But those children, who were between 7 and 13 at the time, felt very awkward walking out of the classroom, sitting silently, and there were teachers who pressed them to say the prayer or go to the principal's office. There were some precedents to support the Engel plaintiffs' challenge. In 1948, in McCollum, the Supreme Court had invalidated a release time arrangement, which involved public schools opening their classrooms to Catholic priests, Jewish rabbis, Protestant ministers, whose parents favored that sort of instruction. Any students who didn't participate would remain in study hall. The court said then that school buildings, public school buildings, could not be used for the dissemination of religious doctrines, and that the compulsory mechanism of public school instruction could not be used to deliver students for religious instruction. However, there was also the Zorak precedent mentioned earlier, with its religious-friendly rhetoric, which had held that release time programs were permitted if they occurred off-school premises, and had called this a reasonable accommodation of parents and children who wished for religious instructions. Thus, the plaintiffs had the McCollum case on their side, were pushing back against Zorak, and the school district argued that this was simply an accommodation of believing parents and should continue. In a striking contrast with our modern church-state litigation, only 5 amicus briefs were filed in the Engel case. The decision was 6-1. Only Potter Stewart dissented. Felix Frankfurter had suffered a stroke, and Charles Whitaker had resigned, and Hugo Black, raised by Southern Baptists, authored the opinion. Black found inherent coercion in the circumstances. He said there was indirect pressure on religious minorities and vulnerable young children to conform to prevailing practice. But he also wrote that the Establishment Clause does not depend on any showing of direct government compulsion and is violated by the enactment of laws which establish an official religion, regardless of whether those laws coerce non-observing individuals. Black rested his opinion on long recognized justifications for the separation of church and state. The idea that a union of government and religion tends to destroy government and degrade religion. He mentioned fear of divisiveness, something Bill Marshall will discuss further, and the need to protect religion from corruption by the state. When Black delivered his opinion in the court, he read it aloud with a trembling voice and paused over the language that prayer was too personal, too sacred, too holy, and then added words not in the published opinion, that the prayer of each man from his soul must be his and his alone. Black's reading had solid foundational antecedents. James Madison had expressed such views in the Memorial and Remonstrance, as had Thomas Jefferson in his bill, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Roger Williams had called for strict separation to protect religion from government corruption. But Black's broad reasoning, rejecting both corruption and religious preferentialism as necessary to finding a forbidden establishment, raised concerns about the breadth and implication of this decision. Black did drop a footnote disclaiming any intention to tinker with other traditional school exercises, such as reciting the Declaration of Independence with its references to a deity, singing patriotic anthems, or reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. But he did not explain, and it was not obvious to many why such patriotic and ceremonial acts were different from the very generic and non-denominational prayer. Justice Douglas then helped matters not at all with a sweeping concurrence that suggested that all such exercises were potentially forbidden, including additional prospective targets, such as legislative and military chaplains, prayers opening the court's own session, presidential proclamations, "In God we trust" on the money and "Under God in the pledge." In Douglas's view, all those references, even the most minimal and non-coercive, implicated the same problem as classroom prayers, simply by evincing government support and finance behind religious exercises. While no other justice joined this opinion, Douglas's views alarmed many and expanded the target zone for critics of the court's decision. And the critics were numerous. "Court outlaws God" was one catchy headline, and over 5,000 letters were directed to the court directly, mostly critical. The Gallup polls showed 79% of the Americans supported prayer and Bible reading despite Engel. The South was especially hostile. One Alabama congressman memorably complained, "They've put the Negroes in the schools, and now they've driven God out." The plaintiffs and their families suffered violent abuse, threats of arson, kidnapping, and job loss. The children were called racist names, and gas-soaked rags and homemade explosives were thrown on their property. But not all rejected the decision. Martin Luther King praised it, calling it sound and good, reaffirming separation of church and state that is basic to our Constitution. President Kennedy was more cautious in his response, but noted that those who opposed it had the easy remedy of praying at home with children and attending church with more fidelity. Other mainline Protestant leaders defended Engel, saying that the regent's prayer was so bleached as to be empty, and emphasized the importance of protecting religious minorities. Some liberals saw connections to the civil rights movement and suggested that complacency over the effects of the prayer mirrored white complacency to racial injustice. But the very next year, the court, far from retreating, granted cert on a challenge to daily recitations of the Lord's Prayer and mandatory Bible readings in Baltimore and Philadelphia schools. In Abington versus Schempp, the court held such practices unconstitutional. The opinion agreed with Engel that non-preferentialism was not necessary for an Establishment Clause violation, nor was coercion. But in other ways, it differed from Engel in striking ways. The tone of the opinion was far more respectful and its scope more narrow. Schempp set forth what would become the first two prongs of the infamous Lemon test, that the government must be neutral towards religion and cannot act with the purpose or effect of advancing it. Justice Clark's opinion assured readers that religion was not irrelevant to public life, quoted the famous friendly language from Zorach, and added that the Founding Fathers believed devotedly in a God and that the inalienable rights of man were rooted in him, thus paying homage to the foundational tenets of civic religion. The opinion went on to make approving references to theistic oaths of office, prayer at opening sessions of Congress, and the court and legislative and military chaplaincies. Clark also pointed out that the Bible was well worthy of study for literary and historic qualities and insisted it could be objectively presented as part of a secular program of instruction. Justice Brennan built on this mollifying foundation with a lengthy concurrence in which he argued that many familiar practices should survive an Establishment Clause challenge, including references to under God in the pledge and other patriotic exercises. Once again, Potter Stewart was the lone dissenter. He contended that such exercises served free exercise value and were essential if schools were to be truly neutral on religious matters. He insisted on voluntariness and did not insist on variety in the sources of the readings. Interestingly, however, his notes in conference suggest that he initially thought each school should give every sect an opportunity to bring their religious materials in, even atheists. This was apparently contemptuously dismissed by Justice Goldberg, who countered apparently, schools can't be open to every sect. What about black Muslims? What about screwball groups? You can't draw a viable line. Engel is the best way to respect religion. The Schempp decision met with far less public criticism than Engel had. The court received fewer than 100 letters. A year's reflection had calmed some of the fevered heat, and the style and tone of the opinion counted for a great deal. And while debates raged in Congress about overturning both decisions, opponents were never able to muster a majority, either for a proposed constitutional amendment or a bill to strip the federal courts of jurisdiction to hear school prayer cases. But were the decisions obeyed? It all depends on where you look. In New York itself, where the prayer had been composed, the percentage of teachers conducting prayers went from 80% before 1962 to 7% in 1965. In the Rocky Mountains and far west, where this had never been common, it dropped from 14% to 5%. But in the South, where prayers and Bible reading had been the most common, the figures barely budged, from 87% to 64% as to prayers, from 80% to 57% on Bible readings. As late as 1997, in Alabama, students were required to attend in-school birthday parties for Jesus and write essays on why Jesus loves me. But the Supreme Court continued to extend the Engel precedent. In 1980, in Stone v. Graham, the court ruled in a brief per curiam opinion that Kentucky could not require the Ten Commandments to be posted in public school rooms, finding that this served religious rather than educational purposes. 5 years later, in Wallace v. Jaffrey, the court ruled 7-2 that an Alabama law purporting to authorize a moment of silence for meditation or voluntary prayer was motivated by an improper purpose, since previous laws already allowed such use. Finally, in Lee v. Wiseman, the court narrowly invalidated graduation prayer in a 5-4 decision. Lee explicitly extended the rationale of Engel to cover graduation prayer, but added a focus on coercion, broadly defined, to cover situations where individuals need not recite an actual prayer, but merely stand quietly. The court expressed concern that such silence might be counted as participation in the prayer, and strongly implied that any official religious exercises in a school would be found coercive. Now, what is important to note is that nothing in these decisions, then or now, has ever affected the right of individual students to pray in a school setting. The Rally Round the Pole movement, which brought religious students and school personnel together at a flagpole before the start of the school day, which has never been found problematic, reinforces this. Students can pray during school, over lunch, before math tests, in graduation, and in a moment of silence if offered. This is purely private speech. This is protected by both free exercise and the free speech clause. All the Establishment Clause prohibits is government speech that endorses or directs religious practices. However, the line between the two can be challenging to delineate with precision. In Santa Fe v. Doe, 2000, the court by a 6-3 margin struck down student-led prayer at football events and reaffirmed that proof of coercion is not essential to an Establishment Clause violation. Santa Fe insisted that the government cannot endorse religion, even when it acts non-coercively, because the school had established the prayer policy, retained control over both the setting and the public address equipment, mandated attendance for participants, band members, cheerleaders, and others. The court found that any objective, reasonable observer would perceive the pregame prayer as stamped with the school's seal of approval. Once again, public resistance ran high. and some schools in the South and West organized rallies in which crowds of football fans joined together and recited the Lord's Prayer en masse, in effect thus accomplishing the circuit breaker that student-led prayer had been intended to achieve by making the prayer fully independent of state action. Now, no discussion of these cases can be complete without a reference to the harsh treatment meted out to the plaintiffs and their children who litigated these cases. They suffered extraordinary abuse, both physical and emotional. But much of this harsh treatment came from those who honestly felt that the decisions had legitimated a heckler's veto, the infliction of the will of the minority over that of the majority. To that argument, the court had made a clear, if not entirely satisfactory, response as early as 1943 in Barnett. Fundamental rights may not be submitted to vote. They depend on the outcome of no elections. The court in Santa Fe found that the student vote, in which barely 10% of the student body had participated, served to intensify the message of disapproval of minority rights. This was, of course, also the powerful message sent by the no pray, no play crowds, with their rising up to take back their traditional football prayers. These controversies continue even today, where a football coach in Bremerton, Washington, who was dismissed for refusing to curtail his policy of taking a knee on the 50-yard line after games, his challenge continues to attract widespread public support. In short, Engel and respect for minority rights continues to be controversial. In the name of avoiding religious divisiveness, the decision and its progeny have garnered both outrage and public obloquy. We must continue to strive, especially today, to move closer to a policy of tolerance, to find the sweet spot where there is play in the joints between free exercise, free speech, and Establishment Clause values, particularly in the formative and contested space of our public schools. Thank you.